Warning: this episode discusses sensitive topics including suicide. Conversations about suicide can be troublesome or difficult for some. If you or someone you know is thinking about suicide, please call or text 988 to connect to the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline or reach out to any local resources you may have.
Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm your co-host, Jodi.
And I'm Matthew.
So, Matthew, how are you doing today?
Oh, just as good as one can be, I guess. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Texas is about to go into a freeze.
Oh,
And I'm currently visiting my parents. So we've just stocked up on a bunch of supplies, and I'm ready to hunker down and maybe do some research or something.
fun. Yeah, no, it was, according to the internet, it was snowing here the other day, but it was not snowing when I looked at it. But if you trust the internet, it was snowing where I was.
Oh, that internet.
Yeah.
So we have a fun topic today, Masada.
Yeah.
Can you give us I'll give the summary, but what is Masada? If someone were to say, "Hey, I've been to Masada," what would you think of?
Yeah, no. So Masada is a fortress in Israel that played an important part at the end of the First Jewish Revolt, and has kind of cemented itself into history. So I think this is going to be different than what we normally do, talking about religious beliefs or religious practices. We're kind of looking at a point in history and some archaeological stuff. So I think it'll be a fun change of pace. But yeah, do you want to give us a brief summary of the Siege of Masada?
Would I love to? So, like Matthew said, there was a revolt. The Jewish people went and separated into different fortresses. And the last fortress that the Romans wanted to reconquer was Masada. And at Masada, there was about 957 people. And the Romans surrounded them, had encampments, and over a period of time laid siege. But by the time they got into Masada, everyone was dead. And there was documentation. This gentleman, Flavius Josephus, said that they had committed mass suicide. But when you look at the archaeological findings, we're not really sure if it matches up.
Yeah. No, I think this is a fun way to start the conversation. Um, but yeah, so I think before we start talking about Masada, um, important to talk about where did this come from. And to start with this, we have to talk about Herod, which you might remember from our podcast a few weeks ago. No, that wasn't last week. Must have been a few weeks ago with Baby Jesus, our Baby Jesus podcast.
Yes, the
Um,
baby Jesus hater.
yeah, King Herod, that guy, the guy known for killing all the babies under 2 years old, he didn't. But that's what he's known for. Also took on a massive building project. And that's really what his claim to fame is in history. And that included rebuilding the temple, and also included rebuilding a lot of other areas and creating fortresses and stuff, including Masada. So
Why
the
was he
siege,
building?
what was that?
Why was he building these things? Just that?
It Yeah, no, generally it was a way to get him to gain favor in the eyes of his people. So you know, by rebuilding the Jewish temple, a lot of the Jews that he ruled over would look at him more favorably. And it had, mixed results. Like he was hated by many, but also they appreciated those aspects. The building aspects of it were two thumbs up by a lot of people. Um, so the building plan started, a couple decades before the turn of the Common Era, until the Jewish Revolt that started in 66 until 70. And then we have the destruction of Masada, the siege of Masada, sometime around 73 CE.
Okay, and the Jewish revolt happened because of general oppression.
General oppression, yeah. I mean, we can get into more details on that later. But this is around the time when the Gospels are written, vaguely, give or take a dozen years or so. So, there's general upheaval. What's going on? Uh, the Jewish people of the area are upset at the Romans, and the Romans are the big, powerful people of the time. So obviously, the Romans win the war. But
Okay,
it's this first great revolt that kind of sets the tone.
so the Jewish people revolt and they overtake multiple fortresses.
Yeah, well, yeah. So it's not like completely separate. Like they're still under the Roman authority,
Okay.
and then the first Jewish revolt happens, and um, Rome destroys the temple. That's kind of the end of it, the center of the cult worship. And then there's some holdouts where, particularly Sicarii, which are kind of violent holdouts, kind of take over some temples, not temples, fortresses and stuff, and they go on, do their thing. Masada being the last one that is taken back by the Romans.
It's really interesting because if you look at like the way the Roman soldiers moved from fortress to fortress, they had to go around the Dead Sea. And so that it all started like in Jerusalem was where the first revolt was, correct?
Probably. I don't know the exact details of that, but
So then they had to move over the top of the Dead Sea east to go to some of the fortresses there until they got to the east side of the Dead Sea. And then they kind of backtracked, went through the wilderness, took out an encampment of Jewish people there over to the west side of the Dead Sea where Masada was. Why did they save Masada for last?
okay, yeah. So I don't know too much on the details of exactly how the Romans did this. Likely they saved Masada for last because of its location. It was far away from a lot of other spots, and it was also very defendable. It was up on the top of a plateau with very steep mountains on the side. There's only one way up to the fortress called the Snake Trail, the Snake Path, which hard to traverse. So it was a very defendable fortress, and so we're going to save that one for last because it's the most difficult. Out of the way, not causing too many problems on its own. The war, essentially ended around 70 with the destruction of the temple, and it's not until about 3 years later where the Siege of Masada happens. So this is kind of just a straggler.
So the final holdout. So the Romans get there and they just set up 8 encampments and kind of just surrounded them because it seems like it would have been very difficult to get into Masada to really have a battle. And so they just set themselves up. The archaeology behind the encampments is very cool, but we'll get into that later.
Yeah.
And they had to make up an attack plan. So what do we know about that?
Yeah, and other people get into this more than I will. But yeah, the archaeology is definitely one of the big things about Masada, why we still talk about Masada. They had 8 encampments. I think there were about 8,000 Roman soldiers involved in the siege. But it eventually happened, and it happened at maximum was 6 months, probably closer to a couple months to a few weeks. But so it was fairly quick. But the Jewish holdouts had tons of food, tons of water. That wasn't a problem. So the Romans had to figure out a way to get on up there. So they ended up building this massive ramp by just pushing dirt up against the plateau and eventually building a ramp to get up there. And then they burned it down and stuff because the snake path was like so hard to walk up. It was skinny and windy and super long, and you're going to have Jewish holdouts shooting stuff at you. It wasn't feasible for that to be the method. So they build this giant ramp that's still you can still see it today in the archaeological digs, which is really interesting.
That's so cool. And then they built a siege tower or had a siege tower, and they rolled that all the way up this ramp to surpass this serpentine path. They get up there, they burn some stuff, they finally break into Masada, and everyone is dead.
Yeah, or at least that's how the story goes. And this is where Josephus comes into play, the very important Josephus. And his story essentially goes that there was a mass suicide, and there was no like big fight in Masada after they kind of got up there. But before we talk about that, I think it's important that we talk about Josephus, because he's a very important figure that will come up in later conversations, I'm sure. Particularly when we talk about the historical Jesus. He's one of our only sources of the first century that's not in the Bible that kind of like mentions Jesus as a historical figure. We can talk about that later. That's another topic, but he's a very important figure. He'll come up a lot. But Josephus. So he was he's the only person other than Paul that self-identifies as a Pharisee. So during the First Jewish Revolt, he was kind of in charge of the Galilee area. And what happens there is they were attacked. His crew drew lots and decided that they were going to commit suicide. And Josephus, at the last minute, chickened out and said, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go hang out with the Romans now. So he's considered this Jewish traitor.
Yeah. So he himself experienced a mass suicide. Was that like a common thing that happened in that era?
It's a common literary trope of that time. And we'll talk more about that when it comes to his account of the siege. But yeah, as Josephus writes about this, it's very interesting because he not only is like depicting an ancient history, but he's also like a pivotal character in some parts of it. So how he chooses to talk about some scenes is very interesting, and he's not to be taken with complete seriousness and complete authority. He's also the only person that we have writing about a lot of these events, so there's nothing to really corroborate with anything. But yeah, anyways, once he gets with the Romans, he's brought before Vespasian. And Josephus says, hey, Vespasian, my dude, my friend, I think you're going to be the emperor one day. And Vespasian says, I like that. I like what you're talking about. I'm not going to kill you. But he locks him up as a prisoner. And luckily, one day, Vespasian becomes emperor. And Josephus says, phew, glad I got that right. Vespasian is happy with that, sets him free from prison, and he gains Roman citizenship, becomes a client of the Flavians, which is where he gets his name, Flavius Josephus. And he's commissioned to write the histories of the Jewish people and the Jewish Revolt. And that's where we get all of his works here. And his two big works are the Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities. Jewish Antiquities is where he gets talking about Jesus and stuff. Very, very small. He mentions Jesus twice. Once we think is like genuine. The other time we think, maybe that's a later addition by some Christians. But that's, again, as I say, another topic. But he talks about the Jewish wars and kind of outlines the Jewish history, which is where we get this account of Masada.
So in this account of Masada, the idea of a mass suicide, what was so scary about being captured by the Romans?
Yeah, I mean, they had a choice between death or, slavery for the rest of their lives. And, as Josephus writes it, they chose death over slavery. And as I said, it's a common literary trope back then. Well, not like common, but like not unheard of. Especially with how Josephus writes. He kind of his main character in this revolt is Eleazar ben Yair, and he gives this like extended speech about rallying his troops and like convincing everyone to like commit this mass suicide. And that's another thing that we see in these mass suicide tropes, having this long speech by someone and it kind of happening together. So it's not clear if a mass suicide is historical or not, but the story lives on, and this is the story that people tell and people hear. And if we want to get technical with it, what happened was all the men killed their families And then they drew lots, and like 10 of them killed all the other men. And then they drew lots again, and one guy killed the rest of the 10. And then at the very end, it was just one guy committing suicide. So it's called this mass suicide. Technically, Josephus's account has one suicide and just a whole bunch of murder.
I mean, I guess one suicide is better than many because suicide is such a sin, but so is killing. So
Yeah.
that's a lot. That is heavy.
Yeah. Well, and that's another important thing to note, that as this story of Masada, happens, is retold throughout time, and especially is retold in the 20th century, the idea of suicide as a sin is something that has to be wrestled with by the people who retell the story. Like biblically, we get accounts of Saul and Judas and, various other accounts of suicide that aren't necessarily biblically, frowned upon. The idea of suicide as a sin is a later innovation, not really biblical. So, it's still, early Christianity said no to suicide, obviously. But, as first century Christianity, first century Judaism, the idea of suicide as a sin isn't really there yet.
Okay. Wow, that's a sad story. And
Yeah.
So he kind of got his information from where?
Yeah, no, that's the question. I think according to his story, there were a few people that survived, a couple of women and children. He could have gotten it from Roman soldiers. He could have gotten it from just stories happening. Where to get his stories, who knows? But he's the only source that we have of, this time period, really.
Why does he get preferential treatment?
As to like why his works survived?
Yeah.
Well, because as I mentioned, he referenced Jesus once or twice. And he's really the only source of that time that was given like authority to kind of talk about what's going on at the time of Jesus. So a lot of the Christians, of the first few centuries liked that and said, hey, this Josephus guy is talking about Jesus and the time period of Jesus, mainly the time period of Jesus, very, very small about Jesus. So we're going to preserve his writings to kind of like keep up what's going on in that time period. Were there other people writing about it? Probably. But for some reason, stuck around, and he wrote a lot. Like his two works are pretty substantial. So there's a bunch we have there. And then we have other authors, Tacitus and Pliny the Younger and stuff like that, who are like Roman authors. But as a Jewish writer, he's pretty much our only source that we have of that era.
It makes you wonder what writings were lost to time.
Oh yeah.
Because there really wasn't a lot. Looking at Masada, there wasn't much at all. And then in order for us to fill in those gaps, we have archaeology. And so they did an excavation in Masada and they found stuff.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the name of the gentleman who did the first excavation.
Yaden, yeah.
Yaden. He found pottery shards with names on them. And he found 12 of them west of a bathhouse. And that seemed to kind of support what Josephus said.
Josephus
said, because that would make sense. But the thing is that they also found other shards throughout Masada and groupings of them. So it's kind of hard to determine, was that from drawing lots or was it from another organizational system they used throughout Masada? Because that's a lot of people in one fortress.
Yeah. No, yeah. So Yaden did his excavation in the 60s, and a lot of the conclusions he drew were to try and not to like necessarily try and corroborate Josephus's account, but he made sense of what he found through the lens of Josephus a lot. So he found that group of 12 potsherds with the names on it and said, oh, this is most likely are the potsherds that were used to draw names. And there's a few problems with that. Josephus's account mentions 10, and Yaden found 12. He explains this away by saying one of the potsherds didn't have the name completely written out yet, so that one wasn't part of it, and one of the potsherds had Ben Yair's name on it, so Josephus didn't count him in the counting. But yeah, no, as you said, this isn't definitive evidence of the mass suicide. This is very likely, perhaps, a organizational system, how they distributed food to someone. So yeah, it's unclear what exactly these ostraca were used for, but they were used for something, and they're still, really cool. I was at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library a while back, and for some reason, I don't know why, they had a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit, and they also had an exhibit on Masada, and they also had like some of those potsherds with the names on it, and it was like really cool to look at. So it was really cool to like actually see those in person. But were they lots to draw who to kill? Who's to say?
Or were they just names pulled for who got to take a bath next?
Yeah.
But it's very cool that they found Eleazar Ben Yair's potsherd.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Ben Yair's potsherd. Was it Eleazar? Oh. Probably, but who knows?
So they found a couple other things as well. They also found 3 bodies in the lower terrace part of the northern palace. Now, there have been different things said about this, but it is very cool. They found a man, a woman, and a child. The man had armor scales on him. The woman's hair and clothing was, not clothing, shoes were intact, and those can actually be found at a museum. But were they the last family standing in Masada? Probably not.
Yeah, no, Yaden claimed that they were. And it's cool. Again, another cool piece of archaeology. It seems as if it was kind of exaggerated. First of all, how complete these bodies were, and second of all, how close they were to the scales of armor and the other pieces of items that they found. I think Joseph Zayas, released a paper, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, saying something along the lines of it's much more likely that hyenas were bringing bones and stuff into this hole. But no, a lot of people think that like this is like the last holdouts. And again, archaeology can only tell us so much. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I tend to believe that this is probably just some hyenas or something like that's hiding spot. But it has this it's really cool. It has like hair from like 2,000 years ago that is like still intact because of like all the dry conditions. It's a great archaeological find. Like this is like by far like one of my favorite archaeological digs. And part of the fun of it is just figuring out, what does this tell us? How does this relate to history?
Now, archaeology, I think, is so fascinating, and I think I would have chills and goosebumps if I were ever to go to Masada and see like where they dug. Do they still do digs? Is there still excavations happening? What's going on in the surrounding area? Also, the Roman encampments, they had enough time surrounding Masada that they very quickly built walls and barracks, and the Romans were so organized. But to go to the top of Masada, look out, see how they were surrounded by 8 Roman encampments, and just maybe for a second try to sink into that feeling of just feeling so maybe lost, maybe defeated already, because they weren't bringing the weaklings of the Roman army. They were legionnaires. And just what desperation that must have filled them with to possibly commit mass suicide.
Yeah. No, and regardless of whether or not this was extensive storytelling by Josephus or a historical event, the myth of Masada, the story that Masada tells, has been very important, especially in modern times, in the 20th century, with the creation of Israel as a new nation again. When Israel came to be again in 48, the slogan "Masada shall not fall again" was a common rally cry, and they had IDF swearing in ceremonies yearly there. I don't think they do that anymore, but it was a common place to visit and travel to for youth events and stuff like that. And it's this big symbol of Zionism and how Masada it has this history of being very important to both Israel as a country and to Zionists. So no, it's very, very relevant to the conversation today and how that works.
I think I'd like to visit one day. What about you?
Oh no, definitely. When I go to Israel, not if, but when, that's definitely a place on my list.
So, as I normally do, I actually watched something with Masada last night. I don't want to say on, it was very much a historical fiction, but it was called The Dove Keepers. And it really helped me to connect to this story of Masada it helps anyone connect when you put a face and names to something like that. But it had Josephus. I will get it right one day. Josephus was played by Dr. Grant from Jurassic Park.
Okay.
Very sassy. But it goes through the story of these 4 women and living in Masada and what it may have looked like. And when it got to the part where it fell to the Romans, it was very intense. The bloody imagery, the families crying for one another.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to suggest it as a historical document, but I will suggest it for the feeling of it all.
Sure.
And to just kind of maybe grasp, because when I heard siege, I forgot sieges take so long. They must have been getting bombarded every day by the Romans to some degree, or at least having minor squabbles.
Yeah.
Squabbles. That's a choice. So I very much enjoyed this episode.
Yeah. No, and how it works to the emotional aspect that it sounds like that the show that you watch was trying to bring out. I think is the intention of how Masada is retold. After the Holocaust, Masada was very influential as a story to kind of contrast between the senseless murder of millions of Jews with creating this story of the last Jewish holdouts, these strong, powerful, brave men that were trying to fight the powers against them. And I think that stands in great contrast to the Holocaust, and it gave a lot of hope and sense to many Jews of the time. But again, the other side, the romanticizing of this has led to Zionism and all the problems that has now. All the controversies of it. So it's a lot. It's as with most things in history, as with most things in as we study the Bible and other religions and stuff, as with all things, there's a lot of ways to take things: good, bad, confusing, but all the time interesting.
What's most important is to do your own research, figure out what it means to you, and just be a good person.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm Very happy. Thank you for sharing this with me. When Matthew suggested it as a topic, I went with that.
Yeah, no, it's a fun one. It's one of my favorite historical stories. Um, but yeah, no, it's fun. Hopefully, we'll do more archaeology and stuff like that. Um,
Oh
topics.
yeah.
I should mention. Jodi Magness is like the authority on Masada. She's done a recent excavation, not recent, but I think maybe recent. She came out with a book like 10 years ago, but I think her excavations were 20 years ago, maybe 30. But she's like the modern authority on Masada, and she has a great book on it and a lot of talks and writings about it. So I recommend anything by Jodi Magness if you want to learn more about Masada.
I'm all for anything by a Jodi.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for joining us. If you want to talk to us some more, please go follow our TikTok if it's still up, YouTube, comment on the Spotify. We're on Twitter. We're on Blue Sky. We're on Instagram. Be nice there. But we're happy you guys joined us here at the Religious Treehouse, and we'll see you next week.
Perfect.
Bye.
Bye.